Okay, does that seem good, everyone?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Yeah. So as someone mentioned, so I'm actually a mathematician and a computer scientist. My background based at Continuum, and there we have a team that's focused on studying what we call compositional intelligence. So this is an approach to AI that's based on this idea of compositionality that I'll talk about today. And I'm very interested in how we can apply this as well in cognitive science and the study of cognition, and conversely, how things from cognition can be used in AI. So today I'm hoping to learn from some people who know more than me about cognitive science in particular, what they think when they hear about these ideas. So my claim is that this phenomenon of compositionality does appear in various frameworks for cognition, lots of places. In particular, it comes up when you have some kind of model of cognition that's normally formal, so it's got some mathematical aspect. And it's based on composition, which means having lots of different components and processes acting on them, which we combine together. And if you want to study this kind of compositionality formally, then the way you can do it is this mathematical language called category theory. The thing that's nice about this in particular is that compared to other areas of maths, it can be studied in quite an intuitive way because it comes with this nice language known as string diagrams that let you reason about these processes and the way you compose them in a very natural way. And because of that, it's being applied to all sorts of topics in science now. So this talk is about really asking the question of what role these kind of formal compositional approaches can play in cognitive science. And I'll try and give some examples to show how I can see them featuring, but I'd love to hear more what you think about this too when we get to the discussion at the end. So what I'm going to do is start by introducing this kind of mathematical formalism of categories and string diagrams, and sketch a bit how I can imagine it being used in cognitive science very roughly. And then the rest of the talk will be unpacking two particular examples of frameworks of cognition I've looked at in a little bit more detail. The first of these is this framework called conceptual spaces, developed by Peter Gardenfors. And the second is an area known as predictive processing or active inference, which is about modeling agents sort of acting in the world and perceiving things via observations. Before getting into all that, just mentioned some of the collaborators in all this work. So the team in Oxford at Continuum is headed by Bob Kirker, and I've worked with the head of AI, Steve Clark, and also Rosine and Sarah here on the approaches to conceptual spaces that I'll talk about, and with Robin on formalizing causal models, which we might touch on at the end. And the work on predictive processing was actually done as part of a FQXI grant with Johannes and Toby here, where we studied the active inference framework in terms of these diagrams. There's lots more of this kind of compositional approach going on in the team in Oxford at Continuum, and loads of other great people there. And in particular, a lot of the work is in an area I won't talk about today, which is in compositional approaches to natural language processing, and also how you can run those on a quantum computer. And if you haven't heard about this before, I'd encourage you to look at Bob's talks about this, which are always very good. I'm sure there's lots available online. So for now, I think I'll get started on talking about this notion of a category in these string diagrams that gives us this language for talking about compositionality. So the basic ingredient here is what's called a category. And a category we can think of as a kind of mathematical world that we're operating in. So to give a category means to specify a load of things that we're studying, which are called objects. So these are sort of types. Here they're being written with these capital letters, A, B, C. And then we're looking at what are called morphisms, or we can think of as processes between these objects. So if we're writing in a normal kind of traditional way, we would write a morphism f from A to B, like this, like the way you'd write a function out. But the nice thing is that we can also just treat them in this diagrammatic way, and this will be the most useful way of doing so that we'll use here. So now what we do is, if we have a process from A to B, we draw it as a string diagram. This is something we read from bottom to top. So the diagram is just this part in black. At the bottom, we have the input to the whole process, which is this wire of type A. Then this process F happens, and then an output is produced of type B at the top. So we read going bottom to top like that. It just says that something of type A comes in, process F happens, and something of type B comes out. And specifying the category means saying what all these objects are and what all these processes are. And what you can then do with them is plug them together in a very natural way to compose these processes. So if I have a process F, like here, that goes from A to B, and a process G that goes from B to C, we can plug them together to get one process running from A to C, on the left. And so this is what we call the sequential composite. It just means process F happens and then G happens. The other main way we can compose these is in parallel. So if we just look at this bottom right part of the picture, it just says we have a process from A to C called F, and a process G from B, process G from B to D, and they're just running in parallel. They're not really interacting. They're just side by side. And the A and B and the C and D, there's no like wires crossing each other and plugging together into other processes. They're just separate. So this is a kind of way of talking about two processes that run in parallel. Formally, what we're doing is we're taking these two objects A, B, and building this other object called the tensor, A tensor B. And similarly for the output, it's one object called C tensor D. But in practice, we can normally just work in a diagram, so we don't even need to write these sort of tensor symbols. So we just have two boxes, can either plug them on top of each other to say do F then G, or run them side by side to say F is happening over here and G is happening over here. If you're going to treat this fully mathematically, you have to write out a lot of axioms that all these compositions would satisfy. But luckily, when you use the diagrams, you don't really need to. They just become very intuitive rules about how the diagrams behave. So, for example, you can basically slide the boxes around on the wires. It doesn't really matter, how long a wire is or something like that. It's just saying it just matters how they're connected up most of the time. And you can also cross wires over each other, as we see at the bottom here. And this is because we're working on what's called a symmetric monoidal category. So it means that you can just cross things around and pass them around, and it really just matters how the boxes get wired up. Finally, so what this means is because of this tensor ability that we have, you can also have processes that have multiple or perhaps none inputs and or outputs. And so a general diagram now looks something like this. So if we just look at this, remember we read it from bottom to top. The whole thing is describing some process that's composed from these sub-processes. It's got a single input of type A. It's got two outputs of type E and F. And it's made from these components that are other processes. For example, this process F that takes in A and puts out C and D. And this process G that takes in B and C and puts out E and F. And in particular, you can have a process which doesn't have any inputs. And that's called a state. That's this row. And when we get to the examples, we'll see a state really is like a way you can say, this is the state of this system B at a particular time. And you can also have things with no outputs at all, and we call them effects. So we'll see lots more examples of these string diagrams as we go on, but they're basically a graphical language. We're talking about different processes happening in parallel or series and so on, and how you can compose them together. So that's all well and good, but you might ask me, what are these actual processes? What is it that we're even talking about? And the answer is that it depends on what category you're working in. So the nice thing about this is that these processes can be describing many different types of things. So I'll try and give 3 examples of categories that I think would be perhaps relevant in cognitive science and relevant for the talk today. Firstly, the simplest is that a process can just be a function. So the inputs, so the wires would be sets, and the processes would just be a deterministic function between them. So the input X would be at the bottom, the output Y at the top, and you just have this function relating them. And these all form a category that's normally written like this, set, because it's a category of sets and functions. So this is used whenever you want to model some deterministic behavior. For example, anything in computation is quite often deterministic. Say a neural network, if you had a neural network model of what's going on, a neural network is essentially a load of functions being plugged together, and often it's even shown in a diagrammatic way. So this is a computational graph for describing a neural network. But you can actually see it essentially as a type of string diagram. So neural networks are basically described as string diagrams where all the boxes are functions. If you're modeling cognitive behavior, though, you might think that things aren't always so deterministic. You might want some kind of more probabilistic aspect to them. So another useful example is when these boxes are actually probabilistic in that way. So instead of being a function from X to Y, it would be what's called a probability channel. So this is something that just sends each point in X to a distribution over Y. So it doesn't say it's going to go exactly to this particular point on the output, but it's some kind of distribution. So say it's likely to be over here or over there. So these form a category that's often called stock because it's short for stochastic. These would be stochastic maps. So I think this would be one that's the kind of setting that would often come up in cognitive science, I think, because you would like to model aspects of uncertainty and what's going on. And for us, it will be useful in talking about generative models and causal models later on. Finally, if you wanted something a bit more exotic, you could consider processes on quantum systems, which have been studied a lot in terms of categories. So a quantum process refers to what's called a completely positive map, but this is just the notion of process on quantum systems. So they form a category. You can use this to talk about kind of things like quantum teleportation, which is shown in a diagram here. But they are actually useful in AI. People are exploring uses of quantum computing, so the diagrams there are very useful. And even in just cognitive sciences, areas such as quantum cognition, which actually claims that quantum processes can be quite a natural way to talk about certain aspects of people's behavior. For example, in question answer experiments, the way that they arrive at their different answers can be modeled using quantum probability. So there you would use diagrams living in this category. But predominantly we'll think more about the first two, or maybe the middle example most, where the processes are kind of probabilistic between sets. So the next thing you might ask then is, okay, well, what's the point of working with all these diagrams and these categories, and what are they good for in cognitive science? So the talk will be about this, but I'll try and just sketch some intuitive answer now. What they're good for, I'd say, is if you have a mathematical, so a formal model of cognition or some experiment, and if it's divided up into some, say, different components and different cognitive processes acting on those. So these components could be things like different modalities, they like visual or audio, smells or taste and so on, or they could be different, more abstract things like representational spaces. And the processes could really be any kind of cognitive process. For
Harry,
example, they could be perceptual processes that relate, say, some input to say a visual input to a representation of what it is that's being perceived. There could be reasoning processes that relate these more abstract kinds of representations. You could have categorization processes that take some input and then output a representation, or a conceptual classification of what's going on. Or maybe something like a binding process that brings together these different modalities. So on the bottom left, we just have an example where, okay, this is a process. We're not saying exactly what it is, but we're just saying what type of process it is. It takes in some visual input, some audio input, some tactile input, and then the agent uses this to classify what the thing is that they are perceiving. So a classification will come out as an output. As another example, you can imagine an experiment where you're asking participants some questions and seeing the probabilities of different answers and so on. So this could be modeled with a process like this, maybe in that category of probabilistic maps we talked about. The wires would be now encoding your model of what the mental state is of the participant. So they have some initial state that goes in, and you'd model the process of actually asking them the question as a process that now has an output that would be consisting of two things. Firstly, their actual answer to the question, and secondly, your model of what their resulting mental state is. So once you've got this kind of formal model, the next thing you can do with the diagrams is use them to just combine models in all sorts of ways and compose them, because this is what they're good for. So I might get to this when we talk about predictive processing later, but you can have examples like hierarchical models, where you just plug together lots of different compositional models together, and you would have something, for example, could describe how a very high-level variable actually comes in at the bottom of the diagram here, like, say, a variable just saying what the object is that's being perceived. As we read up the diagram, we get to lower level stuff, such as the individual pixels or something in the image that results from it. So whenever you have lots of different models, you can now plug them together very easily with these diagrams. And the final thing they're good for is just comparing completely different types of model, because we saw that we could work in all these different types of categories earlier. So just as another example, in the bottom we have this picture. Let's imagine one of these experiments we've been talking about, where you ask participants questions, and they can give answers to these two questions, and what you have at the end is a probability distribution over all the different outcomes. So that would be represented as a state in that category of probabilistic processes I mentioned. So it'd be this box here. This would be your data from your experiment. And a model would then consist of saying, giving processes that fill in what's going on the right-hand side. So you would have some wire that encodes your representation of what the participant's going through in their mental state. You'd put them in some initial state to begin with, and then you have processes that describe what's happening when you ask them these questions, like this example we had. So that would be a kind of, if these boxes were filled in with just probabilistic maps modeling what's going on, that would live in that middle category I showed, say the category of stochastic processes. But we could now completely change what category we're in. Now we could be working in that quantum category, the other one I mentioned, and then suddenly this would be a model in quantum cognition. So if we frame things in terms of this quite high level compositional view to begin with, makes it very easy to switch between these different formal models and compare them, because we've taken the compositional structure as the primary thing to begin with. So that's just some sketchy ideas about what you would use them for in cognitive science. And now I'm going to try and unpack some particular frameworks for cognition in a bit more detail, just to try and bring the intuition forward a bit more. And to do that, I'll start with a particular framework for cognition, which is known as conceptual spaces. So this is an approach developed by Peter Gardenforce, primarily. It's an approach to modeling mainly cognition in humans, I'd say, but it can, and also it can be used in AI, as we'll see later. And it involves essentially working in a geometric way. And we'll see that it has a compositional character to it, which is why we'll be able to approach it in a category theoretic way later. So in particular, it works geometrically, so it assumes that cognition happens in what's called a conceptual space. This is a kind of general cognitive space, and that this is in turn composed, so it's built from simpler spaces, which are called domains. And each domain is supposed to describe a sort of primitive kind of cognitive entity that can't be described in terms of other ones. So for example, you have a domain of all sounds, a domain of all colors, a domain modeling time. You can have more abstract ones as well, but they should all just be things that are distinct and that you can't really just reduce to the other domains. So given these, you combine them together to build an overall geometric space called the conceptual space. And the normal way of describing concepts is a certain regions of the space. So these are the two books where the idea is laid out, and at the bottom we have the papers where the sort of formalization of the theory that we'll use here comes from. And in the right here, we have an example of a simple domain, which would be a sort of color cube, and a concept for something like yellow, which we'll see again in a second. So what I'll do now is I'll spell out this framework a little bit more formally, and then later we'll see how to turn it into diagrams to understand it in this compositional paradigm. So mathematically, okay, it's all about this convexity idea. So it works with what are called convex spaces. So just very roughly, a convex space is a set where we can take convex combinations of elements. So what that means is if I have 2 points in my set, x and y, like in this picture here, I can make a combination like 2/3 x plus 1/3 y. And we'll think of this as lying somewhere in between the 2 points x and y. And so if we keep taking all these different combinations, we'll make a kind of line of all these points that lie in between x and y running from them. And we say that a subset is convex if whenever you look at all these points lying in between 2 points in the subset, you never actually leave the subset. So we take 2 things, x and y, that both live in this subset S, and we look at this line of points in between them, then anything that's in between them will still be in S. We won't leave the subset. So the notion of convex space is really just there so that we can make sense of this idea of a convex thing where 2 points are there and anything in between them is also there. An example of a convex space is just a Euclidean space like R to the n, or any kind of convex subset of that in this sense. And this is basically all we need to define what a conceptual space is now. So if we want to say it mathematically, a conceptual space is one of these convex spaces, but it's one that's given as a product of other convex spaces, which we call the domains. So we have these domains, Z1 up to Zn. They're all convex spaces themselves. They could be something like this color cube, or domain of taste, as we'll see in a second. We take a product of these to build an overall conceptual space. And if we look at a point of this space, we call it an instance of the space. So a point of this space Z will just be given by giving a value for each domain. And now a concept, or here what I'll call a crisp concept, because we're going to get to fuzzy concepts in a minute. A concept will just be given by a subset of your conceptual space that has this property that we saw of being convex. So that idea is saying, if I have two, the subset picks out all the points in the conceptual space that satisfy our concept, and convexity says, well, if I have 2 instances of the concept, then anything that's kind of in between them in this space will still satisfy the concept. It won't suddenly leave it. And this has been argued by Gardenforce to capture a kind of naturality condition on concepts. So there's a simple example now of conceptual space. Let's think of two domains. There'll be one for taste and one for color, and we use them to build a very toy example of conceptual space for foods. So the domain of taste is this tetrahedron here with points like sweet and salt, bitter and sour. And the domain for color is this color cube again. And now the conceptual space is given just by the product of these two, which means every instance just consists of saying what's the taste, what's the precise taste of it, and what's the precise color. So each food would just have a taste and a color here, and that's it. And concepts will now be regions of this space. So for example, we can imagine a concept just for yellow. So yellow just refers to the color domain, so it doesn't care about taste. So it would be the instance can be anywhere in terms of taste. In terms of color, it must be that it lies in this particular convex region. So this convex subregion of the color cube. So this concept picks out all the points that we'd think of as being yellow intuitively. And it was actually on experiments like this that I think some of the conceptual space framework was justified. So there's been lots of experiments looking at the way different cultures divide up colors. And although they always do it in totally different ways, obviously it seemed that they always did so in a way that was convex. So you would never have a word for a type of color where two colors would fit it, but then something that we would say is in between them in the color space doesn't fit that. So it wouldn't be that one's red, but something in between we wouldn't call red anymore. It always seemed to be convex. So that's quite visible here in this color cube example, and the idea of conceptual spaces was to extend this to much more general domains and more abstract ones as well. This is an example of a concept for yellow given by a convex region. But you could think also that really the concept for yellow, it shouldn't really harshly cut off in the way that we see here. So here it's just that all these points are considered yellow, and then everything outside that is just definitely not yellow, and that's it. But really we would probably have this point where the concept kind of fades away as we get to the edges of it. So we'd like to model that as well. And you can do that by talking about what are called fuzzy concepts instead of these crisp ones. So mathematically, a fuzzy concept is a function on your space that just sends each instance to a value between 0 and 1, saying like how well it fits this concept. So 1 would mean it fits it perfectly, and 0 would mean it doesn't fit it at all. And you want this function to respect the structure of the space in some way. If you want to show that these things are well behaved, you can basically arrive at a particular mathematical condition. I don't think it will matter too much to talk about it now, but we could discuss it maybe at the end. But it's called log concavity. It's written with this equation here. The point really is that what it lets you do is, for example, say that if you have 2 points and they both satisfy the concept to some extent, like they're 50% good or 80% good as a instance of this concept. So we're 80% sure we'd call this color yellow or something like that. Then any point that lies in between those two will again satisfy the concept, say 80% well. It won't suddenly go down in the middle. So you can define fuzzy concepts as certain types of functions on a conceptual space that just say how well each point fits the concept. And this includes any one of these crisp concepts that we saw, where it would just be the special case where it's either 1 or 0. Everything either just fits or doesn't. That would be a crisp one. But it includes lots of other nice examples too. So it includes Gaussians, which come up all the time in modeling situations within science. So the function for a normal distribution. And at the bottom, we have two sort of pictorial examples of what a fuzzy concept's like to give some more intuition. So in the bottom left, we have this space, which has all these exemplars with the white dots. So these are some particular instances that we say, yeah, these definitely fit the concept. So we start by forming a convex region around those. That's what's inside the white line. And so anything inside that region must be a perfect sort of prototype, as it were, for the concept. So it gets sent to value 1. And now, instead of just cutting off there, like with the crisp ones, we fade away gradually in this fuzzy way in a kind of Gaussian fashion here. On the right, we see an example of a fuzzy concept for banana on this simple food space that we talked about before. So now we are looking at a kind of slice of the food space where the colors are going from yellow to green and the taste from sweet to bitter. And so here the agent, you'd say, has learned this concept which says that if the banana is sweet, then it's very likely to be yellow. So the values would be nearer 1 around there, whereas sweet and green would be unlikely, so it would go to 0. whereas conversely, if it's green, it's likely to be bitter. This shows how the fuzziness can kind of capture these graded property to the concept, and also that concepts in general can correlate domains. So here we see that color is related to taste for this concept of a banana. It's not just given by one concept on color and one on taste, but it depends how they relate. So these are the basic ingredients in conceptual space theory. What we'd like to do now is see how it connects up with this compositional view from the beginning. So in particular, it means kind of turning the framework into something in these diagrams, these string diagrams we saw. So to do that, you have to first pick a category that you're working in. I don't think the details of the category are that important here. I'll just say that there is a category where the objects are these convex spaces that we're talking about in conceptual space theory. And the processes are basically like these probability kind of channels we talked about at the beginning. So they send each point on their input to a distribution on the output. But now they have this property that they satisfy this log concave condition that I skirted over a second ago. The point of this is just that there is a nice category that essentially models these convex spaces that come up in conceptual spaces and processes which are kind of fuzzy mappings between them, which help us talk about fuzzy concepts. The nice thing really is that once you pick that you're working in this category, all the ingredients in conceptual spaces have a very simple description. So once you're in this category, it's quite simple to talk about concepts and instances and so on. So a conceptual space, Z, given by these domains, Z1 to Zn, is now just a wire that's composed from Z1 to Zn. So it's a very basic kind of composition going on. The conceptual space Z is this left type here. And it's just given by putting several conceptual spaces together. So we just draw the wires in parallel. They're just separate, these domains. A concept now is what I called an effect earlier. So it's a process on your conceptual space. It takes it in as an input, but it doesn't have any output. It just outputs a number, essentially. So it appears as a box like this. So it's just a box where it has an input wire for each of these domains. Whereas an instance will be what I called a state earlier. So it's a process with no input, but it just produces something on Z. And in fact, it will be one that's given by specifying a particular kind of sharp state, Z1 up to Zn, on each wire. So you can characterize these with some categorical conditions and pick out what the instances are. And in particular, it's now we can just see that, okay, if we have one of these concepts and we have an instance, we can see the value that the concept takes on that instance by just plugging them together. So if we have this fuzzy concept for banana or something, we plug in some particular food and we get in this value C of Z, so banana on that particular food Z, and it would tell us how well it fits it. Like, do we think this is a banana or not? It could be 0, could be 1, or it could be something in between. So that applying of a concept to an instance, just is plugging diagrams together here. So this is nice, but what the category lets you do is do more than just this. You don't want to really just talk about concepts and instances, but further structure. Firstly, there's a kind of ordering structure on the concepts that kind of comes out for free because the category has this rule. So it lets us talk about a hierarchy on concepts. So for example, a concept for dark red within this color space is more specific than the color for red. So in general, you can show that the effects, these concepts in the category, will come with this partial order structure, which lets us say one concept is more general than another, or less general. So particular instances are like the most specific kind of concept, and then the broad ones, like a whole huge region, will be more general. Beyond that, though, it lets us talk about ways of combining concepts together. So here we return to this fuzzy example of a banana concept. Now, if we compose it with a concept for green, which could itself be fuzzy, we can generate a new concept for a green banana, which is now here. So it's mainly focused around the green bitter region in the top right of our conceptual space, and it fades out to 0 quite quickly when we leave that. So the category lets you do these things like combining concepts together. And beyond that, you want to go beyond concepts and think about processes in general in this category. So you can think about general processes now, so boxes that have inputs and outputs. So these would now be kinds of mappings between domains. And I think it'd be interesting to work on these more. I kind of think of them as capturing things like analogies between domains. So this example we have here, we've got this concept for banana, which would be a box like this with a wire for color and taste that goes in, and then it judges how well an instance fits banana. And we've done some category theory stuff to turn it into a process going from taste to color. And I think of that as a kind of analogy between the taste domain and the color domain. So it lets us transform concepts on one domain to the other. In particular, you could plug in a color concept like yellow, and now turn it into a taste concept with a kind of analogy. So, for this person who's maybe only eaten bananas, they think something tastes yellow, if it would be the kind of taste that would correspond to yellow if it were a banana. That's essentially what this analogy would do. So in general, I think it'd be nice to think more about these mappings between domains in the conceptual space framework to model aspects of cognition. So here we've basically used the two parts of what I said were good about categories before, but we haven't tried this other third one, which was about changing the category you're working in. So now that we've taken conceptual spaces and framed them in terms of these diagrams, what we could do is say, well, what happens if we change the category itself? We don't work with convex spaces, but with something else. So you can basically take what we've done and use it to define a general notion of a conceptual space called a conceptual model in any category. And you could plug in a different type of category, such as the category of quantum processes. Formerly, these are things called Hilbert spaces and completely positive maps between them. What would we get then? Well, it would be some sort of quantum version of the conceptual space framework. And this is what we've been thinking about recently. So we call this thing a quantum conceptual model. It would now be given by composing different domains together like we had before, but the domains wouldn't really be convex spaces. They'd be quantum systems. And the way you compose systems in quantum theory is with what's called the tensor product. So you'd have this quantum system H, which is a Hilbert space. This is the mathematical definition of a quantum system. And it's given by tensoring together all these different Hilbert spaces that describe the domains. And then we can just run through, okay, well, we had all these diagrams before that describe pieces from conceptual space theory. What do they mean when we're in this different category now? So instances just become what are called pure states on your quantum system. So they're given by specifying a state of each domain in your space. A concept is now, looks like this box again, but now we're just in a different category. Now it corresponds to what's called a positive operator on a quantum system. This is basically how you model measurements in quantum theory. So the way you can think of it as is that you take an instance of your kind of quantum version of a conceptual space, and you want to see if it fits some concept. So you do this measurement, and it gives you either the outcome yes or no. And if it's yes, it means, okay, it fit the concept, and no, then it didn't. But it won't do that with certainty. It will do it with some probability, which we can think of as telling us how well the instance fits the concept, because measurements in quantum theory are always probabilistic. So plugging in an instance into our concept, we get this value. And this is like a fuzzy concept value of how well the instance fits it, which comes from a probability in this quantum measurement. Okay, there's natural to ask, why would you do this though? Why do you want to work with these quantum version of conceptual spaces? Essentially, we've found that it has many of the same features of conceptual spaces normally, because of the convex structure now becomes the structure of quantum systems, which is linear structure on Hilbert spaces. And because of that, it shares lots of their benefits, but it might have some extra advantages too. In particular, concepts can now have what's called entanglement in quantum theory, which gives a way for different domains to essentially be related to each other in quite an efficient fashion. And as I've mentioned, there's a whole area in quantum cognition that's pursuing these kind of quantum models for describing how agents act in certain experiments. And it could be, they've essentially argued that it's quite a natural way to describe certain features of cognitive experiments. So I think that would tie up with this kind of quantum model of conceptual spaces. And equally in AI, there is a number of approaches to seeing how useful quantum theory is and quantum computing for carrying out general problem solving in artificial intelligence and models of natural language processing we've talked about at the beginning very briefly. What we've been doing is doing some experiments in particular with this quantum conceptual model framework, as well as a classical variation of it. So very briefly, I just mentioned that we've done these two types of machine learning experiments with this approach. It wasn't just theoretical stuff. So in each case, what happened is we gave the machine learning system a load of images to look at. These are at the bottom of the picture here. So they're loads of just simple images of shapes, colored shapes. So we have, say here, a green triangle or a blue square, and each shape has a size, a color, position. So from these, we generate a data set of all these simple images, and we feed it to a machine learning system in each case. So on the left, we have a kind of classical one where we took what's called a variational autoencoder, and we trained it to essentially come with its own version of a conceptual space and to learn concepts for these things. So the left just shows this probabilistic generative model that the VAE uses, now equipped with these concepts. So given an image, it now encodes it into essentially a conceptual space. So it has an explicit encoding for the shape, the size and the color and the position of the image. And it can learn concepts for these things. So it can learn the concept of red or the concept of position and so on. And that concept has an explicit representation as a fuzzy concept on that space. And on the right, we did the same kind of thing, but with a quantum model, where we were actually training these quantum concepts I mentioned on a simulated quantum computer. The image is encoded now as a quantum instance, one of these quantum states, and the concepts are learned as these positive operators on the quantum system. So in particular, you can get concepts that live on a block sphere, which is what we see in these diagrams, which is a representation of the state of a qubit. So this is like the most basic kind of quantum system. So we've been training this thing to learn these quantum concepts and seeing how they behave. And there's lots more work to be done here really in understanding the benefits of these quantum concepts, because I think it's going to be increasingly the case that people want to apply quantum computing in AI. And this would give you a kind of native understanding of why it is you'd want to do that by relating these quantum states with actual sort of an interpreted model of what's going on. But I think for now, it'd be better to move on to another framework now that's closer to cognitive science again. And that is the framework of predictive processing. So we've covered conceptual spaces now, and we'll begin with another framework and see how we can treat that one in diagrams. So predictive processing is an approach to cognition that aims to provide a sort of single framework that you can apply both to a single neuron, something very basic, or to, say, a cell, or to a whole brain or a whole organism. So it aims to provide just one framework that you can apply at all of these levels. And in particular, I'm often here talking about a variant of predictive processing known as active inference that's been developed by Carl Friston and his collaborators. So the general idea in this framework is that you're looking at an agent and it's interacting with an external world, a kind of environment. So what it gets from this world is observations that it receives, and it basically wants to understand what's going on with these observations, so it wants to perceive something from them. So these observations could, for example, just be images, and it's perceiving a kind of representation of what's going on. And it does this in order to plan actions it can use to behave effectively in that world. So if it wants to be able to do this planning, it needs an actual model of what's going on. So it needs what's called a generative model that should describe how its actions will affect these world states and how these world states lead to observations. And the reason that the compositional approach is good here is that this generative model is often very compositional in its nature. So it's built from other generative models that were being composed together in lots of ways. So generative models are what we'll focus on here essentially, and say a little bit about inference at the end. So what is a generative model? The simplest form for this would be that you just have a load of observations and your agent has some model that explains how it's reaching these observations in terms of some hidden states. So we can already talk about this in terms of diagrams. So the observations would be given by this type O. They could be things like images that we have on the right here. So an observation would be an actual image with all of its pixel data, like one of these squares. So one of these simple shapes, sorry, that we talked about earlier, a square, a circle, and so on. And the observation as a whole would be a probability distribution over all these images. That's what we see on the left. A generative model is saying, okay, how did we get this this distribution? How do we arrive at this kind of observation of all these images? And it explains it in terms of two ingredients. So and they both depend on this notion of a hidden state. So it comes with some set S that represents the hidden states of what's going on. So this is a kind of abstract representation of the image. So in this case, the representation might just be saying what the shape is and what the color is and so on, like this point in a conceptual space we saw earlier. And then from this, it needs two probability channels, or rather a channel and a distribution. So the most important one is this thing called the likelihood. This is a probability channel that goes from the hidden states to the observations. So for each hidden state, it says how likely each observation would be. So for example, it would say, okay, if we had a red, if the hidden state was that it's a red shape with this exact hue for red, these are the different images that we expect to see, and this is how likely it would be to see certain images. So it doesn't just send each point to one observation, but to a distribution over how likely all the different observations would be. So that's what's called the likelihood. And the model consists of specifying this likelihood along with a distribution called the prior, which just says how likely all of these hidden states are. So this is a sort of primitive version of a generative model, which is where there's just one space of observations and one space of hidden states you're using to explain it. So we can imagine an agent with a model like this in its head that helps it understand the observations it's receiving from the world. But often the models that come up in predictive processing are a bit more structured than this. So there's lots of different spaces of observations going on that all interact. And that's why this compositional approach becomes quite helpful. So you would see diagrams like this often in a predictive processing paper where the state space now is not just one state space, but there's lots of them going on, maybe at different time steps or maybe at different levels of representation. This diagram shows these different state spaces, S1, S2, and so on, and they each lead to their own observations. And we also might want to include other things such as the actions the agent's carrying out. So we're looking for something like a generative model, but with a bit more compositional structure to it, essentially. In fact, these diagrams can be seen to be kind of compositional in their nature, and they do correspond to string diagrams, as we'll see in a second. The normal way you describe them, however, is with what's called a Bayesian network. So a Bayesian network is normally given by basically drawing a diagram like we just saw. It's called a directed acyclic graph, or a DAG, and giving a distribution over it. So just unpacking that a bit, a Bayesian network, say you have a load of variables. They could be these hidden state spaces, S1, S2, and stuff that we just saw. Or here they're these variables X's. Then the Bayesian network would be given by drawing a DAG that says how these variables relate to each other. And it could also say which ones are observed, like the observations we had before, or hidden, like that's hidden state space. And then it's given by actually giving probability channels that describe this, how this distribution over these variables comes about. So you basically give a probability channel describing how each of these variables derives from its parents, or often the way this is thought about is just in terms of one overall probability distribution that you get by multiplying all these together. So it tells you your probabilities of arriving at each of these different possible values for all the variables. So the pair of the DAG and this distribution is what's called a Bayesian network. And the nice thing is that this corresponds to something in category theory. So these DAGs actually correspond to a certain type of string diagram, and this is really where the start of the categorical approach to generative models is. If you have one of these DAGs, you can equivalently draw a string diagram that says the same thing. So on the left here, we have this DAG with these two hidden variables, x1 and x4, and these two outputs, x2 and x3. And in the diagram, what we do is we basically have a box that produces each variable, and this describes the way the variable arises from its parents in the DAG. And if it's an observed variable, we make it an output of the diagram. And if it's not observed, then it won't appear as an output. And to do so, we make use of these white dots that you see in the diagram, which are called copy maps. So they just take in each variable and copy it and pass it along to all of its children in the DAG. So this is perhaps not too surprising, but it just says that this one graphical thing, a DAG, can be understood in terms of this other graphical thing, a string diagram. But what's nice is that the diagrams now have a categorical meaning, so they let you also talk about the processes that fill in these boxes. So we can now define a generative model in a category as basically just being one of these diagrams where you also say what the actual processes are that fill in all of these boxes. So if you worked in that category stock I mentioned at the beginning, you'd get precisely a Bayesian network. So the main point here is just that Bayesian networks can be described nicely in terms of string diagrams. So we can start looking at what people do in predictive processing and write it in terms of these category theoretic string diagrams. Here's just an example of the kind of generative model then that you see typically in predictive processing to give some feeling for the way they're used. Remember, all the diagrams are read from bottom to top. So at the bottom, we have this wire P, and P stands for policies. This encodes action policies, they're called. So they're basically types of behaviors the system can have. So this is where actions come in. And the model says that we have a load of different time steps here, 1, 2, up to n. And each time step, we have a state of the world, this hidden state S, that depends and what the previous state was and the way that we're acting. So you have this policy wire going in and your hidden state, and they produce the hidden state at the next time. And then depending on the hidden state, we'll receive certain observations at each time step. So overall, it's a model that explains a series of observations. This is O1, O2 up to ON in terms of the way the agent is acting, and as a result, the hidden state of the world at each time. So these are the kind of models people study in predictive processing. And what they do with them is often they want to not just read the model like this, going from bottom to top, where you see how it is you got these observations, but you want to go the other way and carry out what's called inference. Oh, sorry, I've skipped over something here, but I also just mentioned that, as we saw earlier, you can take these kinds of models and plug them together to build what are called hierarchical models, where you would have something very high level, in fact, at the bottom of the diagram, like this model of policies and behaviors, filtering up into leading to all these hidden states as we run up the diagram. So often you'd have something like a very high level variable actually appearing at the bottom here, like say a representation of a whole text or a whole sentence, and then it goes into representations of individual words and individual letters along the top, or it could be, say, a representation of whole objects at the bottom and individual pixels or something running along the top. So you see these kind of hierarchical models all the time, and the diagrams help you very easily describe these because you can literally just plug the string diagrams for each model together to build one overall hierarchical one. So given a model like this, as I was saying before, what you want to then do is a process called Bayesian inversion. So before we had this channel that said, if the hidden state S is something, then this process called the likelihood happens, and it tells us how likely we are to see various things to get all these different observations. An inversion, you want to go the other way. So you take an observation and you want to say, well, what hidden state is likely to have caused it? So now we've got this box called the inverse here. This is normally modeled with Bayesian inversion. So it's a channel that takes an observation and produces a representation, or rather a channel, a probability distribution over these different possible representations to these points in S. So given that we saw this, what was the likely sort of hidden state of the world that explains that observation? The nice thing is that people have described this in terms of string diagrams too. And there's all sorts of well-known rules for how you can describe the Bayesian inversion in these string diagrams. So one of them we see at the top here, and the other one is to do with taking this joint distribution described by the model and kind of bending the wire around so you get a process running from observations to states. So what we've been doing in the work, I'll just have one slide on here, is saying that we've been looking at this notion of inference, and in particular how it's used in an area of predictive processing called active inference, to actually be a whole model of planning actions that an agent can have. So basically, in active inference, you're working with a certain type of generative model, one of the type we see on the left here, and we're carrying out inference to plan our behavior. So the model is one where we have actions, again, at the bottom, these policies, and they're producing hidden states, which we can think of as basically just, similar to the one before. We have states that we think of as the current state of the world, and we have states that we think will be the future based on the current state. And each time we receive an observation. So we'll have an observation now that the agent's received, and we'll have an idea of what kind of observations we might see in the future. So this overall generative model is saying these are the likely observations and future observations we expect. Now, let's suppose we actually receive an observation in the present, and that we have some preferences for what we'd like to see in the future. So you can model those as two boxes here, these states, O and prefs. And if we want to invert this whole model now, there'll be something that takes O and F at the top and returns P, this wire at the bottom. And that can be a model that can describe a kind of planning process. So given, essentially what it says is, given an observation that we just had that we want to explain, and given what we want to see in the future, what is the likely policy, what's the likely actions that we would be carrying out to explain both of those? So we're sort of finding a plan for how we should act by trying to retrospectively explain how it is we'd arrive at what we got in the future. So this is what goes on in active inference. And what we've been doing is just looking at how to view the whole thing in this compositional lens to get some conceptual clarity about it. And then what you do is apply these graphical rules for carrying out these Bayesian inversion processes onto a generative model that's described in this way. in this compositional manner from all these sub-processes and diagrams. Just before I wrap up, just briefly mention a couple of other directions so I can see the compositional approach being useful that I've been thinking about. So the formal structures I've been talking about here for treating Bayesian networks are the same as what you'd use to treat what are called causal Bayesian networks that are used to model causality and causal models. So it's essentially the same mathematical structures that you'd use to study causal models, and there's a big area in applied category theory in studying causality in the same way. So if you view one of these generative models as a causal model, what it lets you start thinking about now is what it would mean to intervene on the model. So you have all these different representations of different variables, states of the world, and how they affect each other. And once you view it as a causal model, it means you can talk about what happens if you change something. So here we have this causal model, and there's an intervention happening on this variable s. That means we're kind of reaching in and affecting the diagram. So we're now plugging in a state, particular state for this variable s here, and seeing how this would affect the resulting distribution over all of the variables. So with Robin Lorenz, we've been looking at how to basically treat a lot of aspects of this causal model framework in the style of Pearl in string diagrams, building lots of earlier work that's gone on in the applied category theory community. And so today I basically just talked about these two examples of conceptual spaces and predictive processing and how they look in this string diagrammatic approach. But in future, it'd be good to maybe unify things a bit more, try and put these things into one context. So perhaps one general compositional approach to modeling cognitive processes and one framework for general use in cognition and AI. So that would be very exciting to have in the future. So just to summarize, we went for a lot of stuff there, but the main theme is just supposed to be thinking about this kind of compositional view of formal modeling and what role it can have in cognitive science. So the compositional approach is here, I've said it's essentially about using category theory and these string diagrams, and it's being applied in all sorts of places. And today I tried to show a couple of areas it could be used in cognitive science. And to summarize what it's useful for, in a simple way, I'd say it's good for formalizing processes, so cognitive processes, on representational spaces that have some compositional structure to them, so they're structured in some way. And I just talked about two examples. So the first was conceptual space framework, where this compositional structure was in the domains. So we had these domains like color and taste and so on, and we composed them together to build the conceptual space. And secondly, you talked about predictive processing, where the compositional structure was in the types of these generative models and the way we plugged them together, for example, building these hierarchical models and so on. So yeah, so I'd love to discuss and hear more from people what their thoughts are about the role of this kind of formal approaches in cognitive science. So firstly, what's the role of formal approaches in general, but in particular these categorical or compositional ones? I'd love to know what you think, what role they can play and whether they're useful. And the second question that could be interesting is whether human cognition actually uses these compositional models in the sense of, for example, with a causal model, when we're carrying out causal reasoning ourselves, is it because we're actually holding one of these formal causal models in our head? So something like these generative models we talked about and carrying out these kinds of calculations on it. But in general, I'd be interested in any of your thoughts. So yeah, that's me, but thanks very much.
Thank you for this fascinating talk, Sean. It's very interesting and stimulating indeed. Yes, now we can move on to the questions and answer session. But first, can I ask a very brief question?
Yeah, sure.
Time to our audience. So as far as I know, you are one of the few people working on this quantum cognition. So we are usually more familiar with the term, the definition of cognition in psychology. Is there any definition that you use to describe what actually quantum cognition is in a very brief term?
I don't think it comes with a very specific idea of what cognition would be. So I think it's the places, the sort of uses of quantum cognition I've seen are in modeling these kind of question answer experiments where you use a quantum model to describe the mental state of the participant and how it gives you some likelihood for them answering the questions in certain ways. It doesn't rely on some very specific notion of what cognition is, if that's what you mean. So it wouldn't be based on one framework in itself. I mean, here there would be a beginning towards a framework in the quantum conceptual models part we talked about, because you would have these different domains as different quantum systems being plugged together. So there's a kind of model starting to appear there with a bit more structure. I'm not sure if that answered your question though, but was it about what is the meaning of cognition when you're talking about quantum cognition? Oh, sorry, I think you're muted right now. Oh, Selma, yeah. I think you're muted.
Okay, so I think it's really useful to talk about models when you talk about quantum cognition, and I really like this compositionality approach. I just wonder, for example, when we talk about cognition in psychology, we usually use perceptual and conceptual processes, and we use two quite famously known terms like bottom-up and top-down processing systems.
Yeah.
The other point it attracts my attention is that you mentioned about this predictive processing in your slide. One of those slides, I think it's in the middle somewhere. And you mentioned that so the agent interacts with the external world, usually through observation. So this reminds me, usually this bottom-up processing, we use senses to extract data from our environment, but at the same time, we use top-down processing system as well. Based on the knowledge we develop from childhood to adulthood, we have some ideas about the concepts, we have some ideas about the phenomena. This comes thanks to our top-down processing systems. Some people use this use the term knowledge satisfy this, but it seems like I think this model is usually corresponds to this bottom-up processing. But you mentioned about this compositional approach as well. Sounds like you are combining top-down and bottom-up processing, but it's super interesting for me the psychological point of view to see this combination.
Yeah, the predictive processing, I'd say, is sort of normally viewed as having sorry, I'm just trying to make it so I can see what I'm looking at again. Anyway, it has these two versions of it has these top-down and bottom-up aspects basically in the way it's done. So I'm trying to see my slides again. Yeah. So when you have a generative model, say like this one, it depends how essentially I think this top-down and bottom-up thing you're talking about is sort of explicitly in the way that you have the model going one way here, where it's read the model reading that way, and then you want to carry out this inference process where you're turning it around. So I would say the inference, I guess, would be, I think you would be calling this bottom up in the sense that you're going from an observation, so just like the senses, to arrive at a representation of what's going on. So that's, the lower level stuff, I suppose you'd say, would be the sensory inputs, and it's resulting in something more abstract. So that's kind of bottom up. And the model, although it's kind of confusing that it's being read bottom up, would probably be top down in the sense that you have a more abstract kind of representational spaces at the bottom, and they're leading to ultimately a distribution over these observations. And that kind of encodes more like the knowledge aspect, I'd say, of what you're saying, because this is sort of the model that the agent has to begin with. So this box E here would be normally interpreted as kind of habits. So it's the behaviors that the agent expects to carry out. And then as a result, you get this whole distribution as you read up the diagram. Ultimately, this whole model, right, gives you a distribution over O1 to ON. So basically a distribution over what sensory stimulus you'd expect to see. So that's kind of your prior knowledge in some sense. And then the inference step is about turning it around when you get some new bottom-up It's like you get some new observations, how to update your knowledge essentially.
Mm.
And it would be great to have a version of that kind of story in the quantum cognition as well. And I'm sure there are approaches out there, but I haven't, that's not something I've got a great answer to right now. But you would like to see both of those aspects in quantum cognition as well. It's at the moment, the type of quantum cognition I'm familiar with is more just quite high level versions like this process from the very beginning. That's these kind of question answering ones rather than a full generative model and the idea of how you update it. But the mathematical structures that you use to carry that out with a generative model are things that people are actively researching quantum versions of, essentially. So a generative model will be formalized with a causal model framework, essentially, like a Bayesian network, or it's essentially the same as a type of causal model. And there's a lot of work going on quantum causal models at the moment. So this is how to generalize this idea to a quantum setting. And then the kind of update procedures that you do when you receive a new piece of information, which would be the bottom-up processing, I suppose, would be, there are quantum analogs of those mathematical operations. So hopefully this will start to get pieced together to a nice kind of full version of something like predictive processing, but with a quantum model behind it as well, which would make quantum cognition a bit richer as a framework, I'd say.
Do you see the chat box? There is a comment.
Oh,
Do you want me to read it? It says, concerning compositional models in human cognition, this has been discussed in early sessions of the Learning Saloon.
All right.
Have you seen that note?
Thank you. Yeah. If you wanted to say summarize it or something now, I'd be happy to hear about it. Otherwise, I'll definitely check it out afterwards. Thank you for that. Yes, happy to look at that. I think compositionality is pretty widely discussed. I mean, in NLP, it certainly is a lot. So I'm sure there's all sorts of places where it's come up. And there's a general effort to want to, I suppose the sense I didn't explicitly talk about here was having compositional models like understanding an image or something like this in a compositional way, where you say it's structured from this shape in this position, and this is casting a shadow on here, and so on. So that kind of compositional description, I think, is something people are hoping to have in AI systems more to make their representations more robust. And that's kind of the hope that these approaches is that they would help provide you with that, so that the system has a structured representation of what's going on, and not just like one point in a big vector space and you don't really know what it means. Oh, I don't know if that's the kind of thing discussed there. I'll have a look. Thank you.
If you have any question, you can just simply unmute yourself and pose your question. Meanwhile, can I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
Why do you think, actually it's quite abstract, but why do you think we will need quantum cognition, or where do you see regarding the applicability of this quantum cognition, what would be the impact of quantum cognition on our lives?
Yeah.
It might be too abstract for now, but probably machines or artificial intelligence. I don't know if you would agree with artificial intelligence or compositional intelligence. Do you think this is for the machines, or?
Yeah, I mean, as a model of cognition, I think, it's certainly not intuitive, but the aim would be that it's useful even just for people, firstly, for modeling human cognition. So you can separate it. So it often would get confused with a claim that there's actual quantum processes happening in the brain, like physically, which some people do argue for. But even if that's not the case, so there isn't really like, entanglement or something going on in the human brain, it could still be that quantum models, so the kind of maths that goes into quantum information and so on, is very useful as a model for describing what goes on in cognition, or describing the state of an agent or a person's mind, essentially. And that's what they try to do in these to justify these experiments with this question answering effects and so on. So you would then ask, well, why would that be the case? And essentially it's motivated by, I mean, I'm not, I'm agnostic on it myself at the moment, just to be clear. I'm not sure. I'd like it to be sort of true because I've worked on quantum theory and I know about treating that compositionally. That'd be great. And so I'm obviously interested to find out. I do see some intuition with it. So why it would be true would be broadly that there's something about quantum theory that helps to capture, I'd say, something about kind of integrated nature of a mental state that, you know, something like entanglement might be good for capturing something that maybe it's composed in the sense that you have these domains. So there's aspects to your cognition that are compositional, but there's also aspects that is holistic, as it were. It's not like just a correlation between these things. It's sort of one thing itself. So people try to model that using entangled states in quantum theory. Secondly, there's sort of features of the way quantum processes behave that people would think are intuitive for modeling sort of cognition in the sense of these question answer experiments, for example. They basically, you'd have things like the order in which you ask questions will affect the answers you give, right? It's not that there's just this one objective state of the world that's stored in your brain and then you just access it and extract the data and you don't change the data, you know, when you're interacting with someone. It's that even asking them the question alters their mental state. So the order you ask them or the way you ask them and so on affects it. And so quantum theory is just a mathematical formalism where you could describe these kind of operations that affect the state of something. So you interacting with it isn't just this completely neutral objective thing where you just can learn about it without changing it. You always change the system when you measure it in quantum theory. So people use this to model the fact that interacting with a cognitive agent will change it in some way. So those are the, I think the main intuitions, and just the fact that it helps you to model kind of uncertain things because there's an uncertain nature in quantum theory from the probabilities. But in a way that it isn't just randomness. It's got its own kind of dissolvedness as well. It's a bit hard to pin down as an idea.